Was there anything in the founding of the US that left the theocratic door open, or at least theocratic instincts?
I would say that the founding and its official governmental policies, and actually the aspiration of the Christian churches in early American history, did not have what we consider today theocratic or dominionist implications.
This is Life and Faith, a podcast where we seek to elevate the conversation about the things that matter, or should matter, deeply human questions about meaning, purpose, and hope. No matter what you believe, we hope you'll join us exploring the complexities, the struggles, and the joys of life and faith. Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. Well, as you know, 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, a sacred document for the United States, and there has understandably been a lot of commentary about that, celebrations in the US and lots of events. It's certainly an anniversary of a monumental moment from July 4th, 1776, the birth of the USA and all that has meant for that country and also the world. What has that project been all about? It's an interesting time to reflect on the shaping forces of America, what remains of those shaping forces and the forms they've taken. Today on Life and Faith, we are examining the 250th anniversary and the founding ideals of the USA. How much have they been realised? Where has it fallen short of those ideals? What might the future of the Union be? And what about the contribution and implications of the religious layer to this story? This is contested territory and it takes some untangling. So we will be aided in our quest to understand the story better by three experts. Dr. Mark Noll is an esteemed American historian specialising in the history of Christianity in the United States. He's written dozens of books and is a leading voice in understanding the complexity of the religious history of America. It's a huge honour to have him on the podcast today. His countryman, Dr. Darrell Bock, will provide us with a theological perspective. An old friend of CPX, Darrell was here in Sydney, so we grabbed him to come into the studio. Darrell is a New Testament scholar and cultural commentator. He's the Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary and the Executive Director of Cultural Engagement at the Hendricks Center there in Dallas. But first up is an Australian. Associate Professor David Smith from the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Now, you might remember him from a few previous episodes of Life and Faith. David is a sought-after voice on all things to do with American politics and foreign policy, his area of expertise. My first question to David was, how much of a celebration should this 250th anniversary be?
I think a lot of Americans are wondering the same thing. No matter where Americans stand politically, I think that majorities of Americans for quite some time now have really felt that the country is on the wrong track. And that's not something that began in the last 2 years or even the last 10 years. The really intense political polarization in the country means that even the supporters of the side that is in power often really feel that they are under siege and that the country is heading in the wrong direction. People are perennially disappointed in the leaders that they vote for. We've seen now 2 one-term presidents in a row, although one of them coming back for a second term. We can see at the moment his approval ratings are very low, but they're not that much lower than presidential approval ratings have been over the last decade or so. Approval ratings of everything in the United States are very low at the moment. In Congress, they're usually in single digits. Even approval of the Supreme Court, which used to be one of the few institutions that people trusted, is very low. Perhaps another one of the institutions that Americans trust most, which is the military, Americans are also wondering about that at the moment, because for all of the military might of the United States, it turns out that the US can't just militarily exert its will on another country like Iran. As a result of the Iran war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, Americans are now really suffering economically. So I would say, despite all the things I think the United States does have to celebrate, I mean, it's just a remarkable fact that any one country, let alone a country this big, has managed to survive for this long in a pretty much continuous form. Despite that, I think that Americans are feeling, on the whole, pretty down on their own country and the direction it's going in. And they are really wondering about the place of the United States in the world. They seem to be relearning some very hard lessons about the limits of American power.
Yes.
And even though one of the things that put Trump in power, and that put Barack Obama in power for that matter, was that they acknowledged that there were limits to American power and that they need to be more careful in the world. I think even a lot of Trump's own supporters are feeling that Trump is falling into the same traps that his predecessors did. So I think many Americans will be feeling that perhaps there's not very much to celebrate at the moment. And the celebrations, I would say, have been pretty muted compared to perhaps what they could have been.
Yes, that's very interesting. And you wonder what it would be like compared to, say, the 200th or the one film. I wonder if that would be an interesting kind of study. But when you think about the establishment of the US, and when we think about what that American project is, how would you describe that?
The American project is all about ideas. The great historian Richard Hofstadter said that it was America's fate not to have an ideology, but to be one. And there was this sense when the United States was founded that it was different from all other nations. Of course, European nations would have been the big point of comparison at the time, in that it was founded on ideas rather than on blood and soil.
Yeah.
And what we see to this day with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution is these are basically sacred documents in American life. People interpret these documents in all kinds of ways, but you'd be hard-pressed to find an American who would say that they would disagree with these documents. And so you can have Americans from the left and from the right both swearing absolute allegiance to the Constitution and saying they are the ones who are living out the true values of the Declaration of Independence. And they'll completely disagree with each other, but they will both venerate those documents. The US is really quite unique in this respect, where its major political symbols are words, or its major political symbols are ideas, its major political symbols are documents. People will go to extraordinary lengths to at least make it seem like these documents fit with their own beliefs. That is really quite unique. Even in Australia, which in some ways has similar national origins as a former British colony, which actually borrowed a lot of its constitution from the United States, we don't revere the Australian Constitution in the same way that Americans revere the American Constitution. Most Australians, it's fair to say, have not read the Australian Constitution. And to be fair, it's not the most readable document, unlike the American Constitution, which is actually quite poetic in some parts.
Yeah.
When I think about the role that the Australian Constitution plays in our public culture, I think of the movie The Castle, where the lawyer Dennis Denudo appeals to the Constitution, but then can't explain what part of the Constitution he's appealing to. He just says, it's about the vibe.
Yeah.
But I think it is fair to say in the US, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, with its very lofty natural rights sentiments, these are basically sacred documents in American life. And I think these are still the core of the American project. But as I say, people interpret these in very, very different ways.
And as you say, it's astonishing how successful that's been, really, over this period of time. When you think about American exceptionalism, sort of light on the hill sort of stuff, which seems to me at its worst, it kind of turns in on itself. But how do we make sense of that versus the hope that America offers and has offered? I mean, can you have one without the other?
Yeah, so American exceptionalism, as I was explaining to my students yesterday, there's always a debate over how exceptional American exceptionalism actually is, because every country views itself as exceptional in some way. And very powerful countries have always seen themselves as exceptional. If you look at, for example, every country that has nuclear weapons, they tend to see themselves as being at the center of human experience. One of the features of American exceptionalism was that there's this really covenantal basis to it. The early American colonists very much saw themselves in covenantal terms. That is what the City on the Hill sermon was about, that took place before the colonists even reached Massachusetts Bay. So there was this real sense of Americans as a chosen people. Yeah. But even that is not completely unique. Anthony D. Smith, who is a great scholar, political scientist of nationalism, he points out, once again, in many, many powerful empires, there has been this sense of divine chosenness that has come with it. And I think that sense of divine chosenness, it does create this enormous sense of moral mission. It was this idea that the United States was not just going to be a country like any other country. And bearing in mind, once again, their reference point was these European countries that were run by very self-interested monarchies that didn't seem to have any interest in their own people, let alone in the will of God. And the idea was that the United States would be a godly example to the rest of the world. You know, the City on the Hill, the eyes of the world shall be upon us, which made it a very high stakes enterprise. Because as the rest of the sermon goes on to say, which is not normally quoted, that if God should withdraw his support from us, we should be made something like a name and a byword throughout the world, something not very good. The idea was, if we fail God, and we will lose God's support. So the whole idea was that it was very, very high stakes. And I think that I see both sides of that to this day. Americans believe that the United States should be an example to the rest of the world, and they feel very pained when they don't think that the United States is setting a good example for the rest of the world. But it also means things like elections become very high stakes because people see them as being at the center of a cosmic battle. And certainly something I've always witnessed in elections in the US, from the first one that I was there for in 2004, was you really do get this rhetoric on both sides that if we lose this one, then we've lost the country. And there'll never be another election again. Right. But once again, this stuff didn't originate with Trump.
Yeah.
So making all politics so high stakes, that, again, as a point of comparison to Australia, I much prefer Australian elections where people might get upset about the result, but nobody thinks that it's the end of the world. Whereas there is this really apocalyptic sense that you often get in American elections. And I think, these are both sides of American exceptionalism.
A really important question when it comes to the founding of the USA is whether the US is or ever was a Christian nation. People have strong views on this, but as you will hear, it's complicated. So let's go to the Bible scholar first. Here is Darrell Bock.
Not true, and sort of never has been. I tell people that when they look at the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution and what stands behind that the United States is built on two wings. One was an Enlightenment wing, and the other was a Judeo-Christian wing. And it was flying with two wings. The Enlightenment brought in the variety of dealing with the pluralism, including the establishment of the freedom of religion against an establishment clause in religion that said you could be a Baptist, a Presbyterian, an Episcopalian, and you could be an atheist or an agnostic. Rhode Island was founded by someone who was an agnostic. I guess that's the closest founding to Australia, being with convicts. So you could be any stripe whatsoever. But you had this Judeo-Christian wing, and this is where my response has a subtlety to it, because although the U.S. wasn't a Christian nation, Christianity was a massive cultural influence on ethos of the country is founding. The Pilgrims go back. They were deeply committed Christians when they came over and established Massachusetts colony. So there's a huge Christian overhang over the nation, but the idea that it was a Christian nation, problem. Now, look what's happened to the two wings. The Enlightenment's been challenged by postmodernism. There are elements of that wing that are gone. And the Judeo-Christian element has been challenged, and that's on shaky ground depending on where you are in the country. So our plane with two wings has now become a missile, and we're trying to find ourselves.
What, or is there anything problematic from a theological perspective about this picture of America as sort of a chosen nation, the light on the hill, or God's favored nation? I imagine you would think there's a challenge there, right?
There is a challenge, and that is if I push that too hard, I begin to ask myself, so what's the church? This is why I sometimes say when we put our hope in politics or in a particular nation in the world and the political scene that comes with that, we actually risk doing away with the rationale why the church exists in the midst of that world. And that church exists to be transnational. That church exists to transcend nationalisms and to actually do the business of bringing people together of various backgrounds rather than having them be competing apart. So, yes, the idea that any nation, it doesn't have to be America, put anything in the X, any nation that sees itself in that exclusive deliverance light is encroaching on space that is God's.
Yeah, how does that relate to, though, the sort of sense of continuity between the Old Testament's ideas of a chosen people and what happens in the New Testament? I think you'll say there's a shift that happens there that seems like some Christians want to draw a kind of straight line there between those two.
So there are two things that are happening. One is it's a misunderstanding of what Israel was to be as a chosen people. Because, yes, Israel was a chosen people. It was the place where God was going to really work. But the reason God was going to really work there, the hope was, is that that blessing that would come to Israel would spread out into all the world. That never happened, okay? Or at least it didn't happen through the nation. It happened through Israel's Messiah, Jesus, okay? So there's that dimension of the equation. Israel was never designed to be the chosen people just for our own sake. This is a principle of God's. God gifts people so that peoples can be served. The second element is that these nation groups that start off as a nation has now been transformed in the New Testament to a transnational entity, the church. Church is made up of many tribes and many nations. It's not designed to be focused on one people. It's the idea that both Jews and Gentiles have come into the one new man. God's doing something new. That's the language of Ephesians 2. And even though in the program of God, I deeply believe this, even though in the program of God, Israel still has a future, her future was never for the sake of Israel alone. It was always for the sake of all humanity. And so the idea that there would be a nationalism that comes out of this is something the Bible was never embracing, even when it applied to Israel. Because Israel was supposed to, the seed of Abraham was supposed to be a source of blessing for the world. That principle has never gone away from what God is doing. And in fact, at the core of his salvation is the idea of, I'm going to take estranged people, people who don't get along, people who've been fighting with one another, and I'm going to make them family. A revolutionary idea in the first century, still a revolutionary idea in the 21st century.
In many ways, this question and related topics of is America a Christian nation is one that has occupied historian Mark Noll for much of his career. I knew he would be a good person to put this to.
It can be guaranteed that if someone makes one statement about Christianity and the American origins, it's going to be false. There just has to be multiple perspectives at any one time in looking at the founding of the United States. On the one side, American culture is overwhelmingly Protestant. At the time of the American founding, there were probably 25,000 Catholics in the United States, a few hundred Jews. So when people say the United States was founded as a Christian nation, it is true that all sorts of assumptions, things taken for granted, were Christian. So as an example, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, who by no stretch of the imagination were conventional Christian people, were asked by the early Congress of the United States to propose a seal of the United States. Jefferson wanted to propose the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire that led the children of Israelites in the desert. Franklin wanted to have a picture of Moses with his hand extended over the Red Sea to divide the Red Sea with the Egyptians in the background. These were, we would say today, not exactly secular, but certainly not Christian voices who yet were turning to the Bible to bring up symbols for the United States. That kind of taken for granted Protestantism can be found everywhere. In the early United States, after the Constitution was passed and the government was established in Washington, D.C., Christian worship services were held weekly in the hall of the House of Representatives into the 1830s and 1840s. By 1930, a Catholic was allowed to give the sermon. And I think a little bit later, there's actually a Jewish person who was allowed to give the sermon. Okay, that's one side. On the other side, we're actually going to get to three sides pretty soon.
Okay.
On the other side, much of the ideological grounding for the United States came not from direct Christian sources, but from a heritage of British descent that had arisen in the late 17th century when Parliament ousted King James II, called in William of Orange, and established a government where Parliament was going to be at least on a par with the king. And in that era, those who were most ardent for reform were called the Whigs. In America, the political ideology that had the greatest impact on the revolution was from people called the real Whigs, people who had gone further with the political developments of the late 17th century and over the course of the 18th century emphasized things like absolute power corrupts. Corruption leads to an absence of freedom. France, in the middle of the 18th century, was the avatar of tyranny, Catholicism, the scorn of the Bible. But when Parliament began to impose taxes, restrict the slave trade of the colonists in the 1760s, all of a sudden, the real Whig ideology fueled colonists to think, no, it's not France that's the major problem, it's Britain itself. Parliament was acting like they were conniving to take away liberty for America. So this was an ideology that was mostly secular. And that ideology was really important for winning independence. Then, when the United States set up its own government, the attitude toward religion was neutral, but wanted to avoid strife among Protestants, among Christians. So the Constitution itself says there's to be no religious test for public office. The First Amendment to the Constitution in 1791 guarantees the freedom of religion, but also the absence of a religious conformity imposed upon the American people. But there's no alternative religiously to the Protestant worldview. And there's a real strong secular ideology behind the revolution, and the founders did not want to give preference to any particular religious expression. So in the present day, if you look back and say, well, it's a godless constitution. Yes. You look back and say it's a Christian country when it's founded. Yes. There was an acceptance of religion in public life. Yes. But there were also clear distinctions drawn between organized religion and the state. And what was particularly distinctive about the American religious scene was that believers, for the most part, there are the few exceptions, believers gave up the European expectation that the institutions of state and the institutions of the churches should be intertwined. American religion proceeds voluntarily. So the United States founding religiously has a lot of complexity. And again, to repeat, if you hear one thing about the religious character of the early United States, it's wrong.
I want to think about how the Bible was so important in the success of the Republic. I've heard you say that it was thought of, at least, of keeping the Republic on course and enabling people to govern without kings, which is obviously a very controversial idea.
people look back, sometimes Christian believers look back and say, well, there's all these Bible references in early America, so it must have been a Christian country. Half right, half wrong. The Bible, much more than Shakespeare, was the one almost universally available book. And again, you can find all sorts of people, believers, active Christians, unbelievers, secularists, drawing metaphors, drawing language from the Bible.
Yeah.
Sometimes, as in the Revolutionary period, there were just flat-out abuses. One of the great verses used by the patriots during the American Revolution comes from the book of Judges, when the people of Israel were going to battle, and a little community of, I think, Benjaminites in Meroz refused to go along with the Israelites. And there's a verse from Judges, curse ye Meroz for failing to come to the aid of the Lord's anointed. There were several patriot sermons in several parts of the United States preached on that text against the loyalists. That having been said, so a lot of just ordinary presence of the scriptures, some flat-out abuse of the Bible. But then because, as a Christian believer, I want to say the Bible has a message that transcends the politics of any one place, that offers hope, that offers a way to understand God's working with the world. And in particular, as a Christian, the reason Jesus Christ is so important for the history of the world, that understanding that there's a message for Scripture that calls you out of yourself, is able to criticize your own best actions, that message is there. So again, all of these questions involve way too much complexity to put on a postcard, but they underscore both the difficulties and the importance of having a general frame of reference like the scriptures that have been the case for American public life.
This is Life and Faith, and we are considering the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, signalling the birth of the United States and all that has flowed from that moment. In the US, the notion drawn from biblical imagery of the country itself being a kind of city on a hill and a light to the nations and a new kind of Israel has been drawn upon by writers and politicians and leaders of various kinds, especially in the last 50 years. But what's been the impact of this idea? It's easy to see how it can be problematic. What does Mark Noll think of it?
It is a problem, but again, with a complex history. The early settlers of New England had a very strong sense that they were God's people in some kind of parallel, some kind of analogy to the people of Israel. In the recent decades, there's been a lot of attention to the sermon that the first governor of Massachusetts, John Winthrop, preached somewhere early on in New England's, Massachusetts' early history, in which he uses the phrase from the book of Matthew about being a city on a hill. Now, that expression, leaving out a lot of detailed history, but that expression only became prominent when John F. Kennedy drew upon it in his last speech to the Massachusetts legislature in 1960, before he went to Washington to become president. And then Ronald Reagan used it an awful lot for describing the United States. And then since then, there have been historians and contemporary students who've found just everywhere. Well, the difficulty is that when John Winthrop, the early Puritan, used, "You shall be as a city on the hill," he was thinking about the New England Puritans as the church. They were going to be a city on a hill, not in a national sense, but as an exemplar of how people who could organize their lives by how they thought the scripture thought they should be organized could be an example to Europeans to reform their churches in the same way that the Puritans were reforming their church. So there really was no national United States relevance to that city on a hill. But because of the analogy that particularly by the time the American Revolution was present, you did have people thinking about, well, aren't we like the Israelites escaping from Egyptian bondage? Parenthesis, again, African-American slaves in the 1770s thought that the patriots were Egypt and the British, who offered some kind of relief, were Moses leading them to the promised land. I think probably if you used the analogies and parallels with the Old Testament in a very loose sense and said, well, every society that has a Christian population probably can draw important lessons from the story of the Hebrew people in the Old Testament. That probably would not be too bad. But where you have a sense that because we are the chosen people, we may act like the Israelites, who we remember did a lot of killing of people around them, then you have a real problem. And there certainly was the case in what's called manifest destiny, 1830s, 40s, 50s, on into the rest of the 19th century, where there would be what I would consider quite an illegitimate application of ancient Hebrew history to the United States. One of the strongest theologians in the period of the American Revolution was a man named Samuel Hopkins. He happened to be one of the strong abolitionists in his era. At one time, in writing about slavery, he said, the distinction of Israel is at an end. All people now are open to the same message of God's grace, God's forgiveness as any other. And that note, that Christian conclusion that the promises to Israel now apply to the whole world, at least as potential Christians, has been an element in American life, though not nearly as large as the effort to see the U.S. as, in some sense, the renewal of Israel in the modern world.
Was there anything in the founding of the U.S. that left the kind of theocratic door open, or at least theocratic instincts?
I would say that the founding and its official governmental policies, and actually the aspiration of the Christian churches in early American history, really did not have what we consider today theocratic or dominionist implications. In the early United States, however, religion flourished when popular, effective communicators were able to present the message that they wanted to present and convince listeners of the truth of their message. That meant that public space was open for convincing voices that were particularly able to use the cutting-edge popular media of the day. So in the 1820s, 1830s, it was Christian revivalists. Charles Grandison Finney would have been the great example, who were very effective presenters of the Christian faith because they mobilized newspapers, popular publications, knew how to organize rallies, and made Finney's understanding of the Christian faith very attractive. Later, there were effective popularizers of other things. We've talked about civil rights here and the short-lived Reconstruction era. There were very effective white Southern voices who, despite the outcome of the American Civil War, continued to champion the racial inferiority of Black people, and who were very effective in convincing large numbers in the South and surprisingly considerable numbers of white people in the North. It was because they were effective popular communicators. I think, from my own understanding, the post-World War II era has seen effective popular communicators, some of whom have a theocratic vision for the United States. If the laws were good for ancient Israel, they should be imposed upon the United States. I don't see that as inherently built into the founding or the founding era. I do see it as a function of effective communicators able to use popular media to convince people in the direction that they want to move.
The US is certainly not alone across history in having nation, politics, and Christian faith entangled, but it is an element of the history of the US and remains a question of acute public interest today. So I asked Darrell Bock, is it a problem whenever you see the Bible and the national flag together? Here's Darrell.
It's absolutely problematic. That doesn't mean that people can't aspire out of their sense of national allegiance, wanting the best for the nation and hoping that the nation lives up to ideals that people should live by. I'm not saying nationalism is irrelevant, but nationalism needs to be checked at the door because the Christian faith says that every person matters, every race matters, every nation matters to God.
And therefore, when you favor one over the other, you're running up against, aren't you? What the biblical picture would be and the vision that it's inviting people into.
Exactly. The vision is a transnational vision. The vision is the idea that all of us are in the same boat with the same need for God, regardless of our nationality. All of us need what God is offering to every nationality. That's the biblical vision. And there's another element that's important, and that is, yet God has created us with difference that we're supposed to respect and that we're supposed to acknowledge. But that difference doesn't need to be a threat if it's aligned to the living God.
I'd love to know how that lines up well. I wonder, do you experience this kind of thinking that I've been describing in your world? Is this something you're having to wrestle with?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously we're running into it all over the place in terms of thinking through what it is that the church is called to be in the midst of the situation we find ourselves in. And my take is that we're not doing as well as we ought to be as believers. That this transnational element of what the church is supposed to be, which should orient us towards being open to reaching out to anyone and everyone, is being swamped by nationalist concerns that for a society are legitimate to sort through, and there are real questions there. I'm not trying to belittle that. But in the end, I'm supposed to be sensitive to where all people made in the image of God are coming from and where what all people need that God has to offer. And God is, as the biblical line says, is no respecter of persons, which means he treats everybody the same.
An aspect of the American religious landscape in recent decades has been the politicization of faith and the capturing of a significant voting bloc, white evangelicals, by the Republican Party. Evangelical, which used to signal a whole host of theological commitments, today mostly is a political label. How did this come about? Well, Mark Noll can help us understand.
My own reading of the current situation is that the roots are found in the 1950s and 1960s. Until the 1960s, white people identified as evangelical Christians were divided about half and half between the Democrats and the Republicans. The passage of civil rights legislation in the 1960s, alongside the cultural upheavals of the 1960s, disengaged Southern white evangelicals from the Democratic Party and brought them eventually into the Republican Party. So at the same time as you had a breakdown of what had been a kind of racial binary, there was also a cultural shift that frightened, disturbed, but that fright then got translated into partisan politics. As late as 1976, in the election between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, both, in some sense or other, evangelical Christians, the vote was about 50-50. By 1980, the vote had swung over white evangelicals for Ronald Reagan and continued on, as we know, until the figure of usually 80% or so, white evangelicals having voted for Donald Trump. And what, again, I think is so important for Americans to realize is that around the world, really serious Christian believers, sometimes known as evangelicals, sometimes conservative Catholics, don't align with populist right-wing parties. In the United States, that has taken place. White evangelical voters overwhelmingly back the Republican Party. At the same time, again, complexity, African-American communities, which in their churches reflect an awful lot of traditional evangelical emphasis on Jesus, emphasis on the Bible, emphasis on conversion, African-American communities are just as strong for the Democrats as white evangelical communities are for the Republicans. So I at least talked to a few people, and historians are not very good at collecting anecdotes, who say, no, I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I voted against the Democratic Party. So in my understanding, the word evangelical should reference, first of all, a series of emphases in Christian tradition. Reliance on the Bible, belief in the need for conversion, the belief in Jesus as the key to salvation. But in American public life, evangelical is being taken to mean a supporter of the Republican Party.
That's political.
Which is, yes, becomes a political word, and it just historically considered it doesn't make sense in light of what's happened over the last 40 and 50 years, it probably does make sense.
You've done huge work on the Bible in public life in America and the influence of the Bible on American history right throughout. I can't ask you to sort of cover all that now, but wondering about the degree to which you think that influence has continued up until today. Because it's one thing to say the Bible's played a part in the history. To what extent is it still present?
It is a good question, and things may have changed pretty dramatically even in the 21st century. Early in the century, President George W. Bush made one of his most effective short public pronouncements after one of the space shuttles collapsed and killed everyone on board. And in that address, he quoted from the book of Isaiah with words that were entirely appropriate, exactly the right words to bring some kind of reassurance and hope. President Barack Obama was called upon to bring the memorial for Pastor Clement Pinckney, who, along with several parishioners, gathered for prayer in a historic church in Charleston, South Carolina. President Obama began his address by quoting from the book of Hebrews, talking about how Pastor Clement Pinckney had been a man who emphasized the Bible's message of grace, and famously ended this eulogy by leading the congregation in singing Amazing Grace. In many ways, maybe the most effective use of the Bible in public life since Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, where there's 5 or 6 strategic Bible quotations leading to Lincoln's conclusion with charity toward all. Now, were those moments from George W. Bush and Barack Obama typical? Did people realize what they were hearing when the scriptures were used in this way? I don't know. That's a good question. In public life, more recently, the Bible tends to be weaponized. I have my firm belief that something should happen or should not happen, and I've got a Bible phrase to throw in your face. And that actually is what's happened a lot in American history. And in the American Revolution, there are a lot of sermons in Galatians 5:1. Stand fast in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made you free. But the Patriots and the Loyalist sermons were very, very different and using that same text. So I don't think historians are really good at judging the contemporary public, but my own sense is that the Bible is still alive in public life, but its transformative potential might be in question.
As Americans celebrate and contemplate the birth of their country, and the rest of us join them in reflecting on that huge moment, the question of what the US still offers today is a live one. I thought it would be good to hear from each of our guests on this one. So first, Mark Noll, then David Smith, and then Darrell Bock.
This is quite a controversial question now, given the nature of the current presidential tenure and the hot debates that are roiled the United States and actually, I think, much of the world as to what the present regime is trying to do. But a good thing for me, and going over material I've studied for more than 50 years, is to see in the remembrance of events in the 1770s a pretty big contrast between ideals and practicalities. One of the great debates now in the country among people who know about the 1770s is, were the claims that all people are created equal, that there is a kind of openness to all humanity, were they fundamentally unloaded? Were they fundamentally contradicted by the obvious inconsistencies, continuation of slavery, the expulsion of Native Americans, the robbery of their land, the discrimination of different kinds? And that's actually been a good debate to, I think, in some ways, rescue the ideals. I think some of the best commentators on American public life today, like the very fine multi-episode series by Ken Burns on the Revolution, tried to bring together the statement of the ideals. The United States was going to talk about citizens rather than subjects. And that difference really did have an impact on what came later in America. But at the same time, and the Burns series is really good at this, he would pause and hear from historians about women's life in Revolutionary America, which was very discriminatory. You'd hear people talk about African Americans for whom the British were the Exodus and the colonists, the Patriots, were Egypt. So trying to bring together different elements. I think I've come away with a greater appreciation for the ideals that later on Abraham Lincoln would fasten onto as the central meaning of the United States, as he would most famously probably in the Gettysburg Address from 1863. But at the same time as appreciating more of those ideals, citizens rather than subjects, all people created equal, God-given rights and privileges to everyone, I'm also more aware of the contradictions to the ways in which American history, the history of all countries, contradict their ideals. So it's a complicated season, made more difficult by our internet age, where the radical voices, the extreme voices, are the ones that get heard most readily and most often.
The United States has always offered to the world is the expansion of possibilities. And I think that that is still what it offers, and that is still why so many people from all kinds of places want to immigrate to the United States, whether from poor countries or rich countries. It's not just the personal opportunities that people see there. It's the idea of being in this country where the whole world's possibilities are always being expanded. And a lot of Americans look back quite fondly on things like the moon landing, where the United States, probably at the peak of its global power at that point, then made its mark on space as well. And there was this sense in which the United States was expanding the possibilities of the whole world. It is still right at the forefront of scientific and technological research. And even though a lot of us are quite worried about where that technological research might be taking us, nonetheless, that's where the energy is, that's where the thirst is for finding these things out. And one thing that I do keep remembering is during 2020, I would say the one thing the Trump administration got right about the pandemic was pouring a huge amount of resources into the development of a vaccine in record time. And it wasn't just in the United States. That Operation Warp Speed, as they called it, that hastened the development of vaccines all over the world. And those vaccines may not have been perfect, but they did still save lives. I mean, that was a sort of example of American leadership that I think people used to think was very commonplace, but people perhaps don't see so often anymore, but which is still possible. That's the best that the United States has always had to offer. It is this expansion of possibilities. And, people from different parts of the political spectrum all over the world take inspiration from things that are happening in the United States.
I think that America has and is been fueled by a sense that she represents a kind of experiment in the world around democracy. And whether a person has been politically left or right, they share that perspective on what America offers the world. I think that's under pressure right now. But that ideal helps to drive the country, I think still exists. And that's why people are so passionate over it, because on the one hand, there's a moral challenge that the right is feeling and reacting to. And then there is a different kind of moral challenge that the left is feeling and reacting to. And we're in the business of trying to sort that out. When you live in a fallen world is a dysfunctional world in which things are not calibrated properly. I tell people most political issues that we discuss involve virtues that are colliding because things are not in alignment. What our political parties do is they each pick the virtue that they want to lift up, and they try and minimize the virtue that's in tension with it and pretend that there's a clear choice. And then we do that, we don't actually ask the question we need to ask, which is, how do we better calibrate these two virtues that are colliding so that they aren't so much running against each other, but they're actually in better alignment with each other? And when we fail to ask that question that way, which means we're listening to all the voices that are expressing concerns, we don't do ourselves any favors in terms of how we react. But the idea that has driven the United States, I think, has been a sense of we are an experiment in democracy that up to this point has worked. In fact, our national motto is out of many one, e pluribus unum. And so we even got the word pluralism in there. I mean, out of many one. And we've been able to function that way That's what's under pressure right now, because what's being suggested by some is some of the many don't belong. You can't operate in the way that we've operated over 2.5 centuries if that becomes the dominant view.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to our guests today, our doctors, Mark Noll, Darrell Bock, and David Smith. It's great to have them all as part of the episode. Please do send this episode on to someone you think might like it. Do it right now before you forget. And thanks to our producer, Alan Douthwaite, who is his own light on a hill. Thanks, Al, for pulling all this together. It's been a huge episode. Next time.
I had gotten married at 20, and there have been times during that marriage, like when I was doing my master's degree, writing a project on the Song of Songs, where I was really at a low point in that marriage and really dissatisfied, and I would say like inclined towards infidelity. And to be studying this book that warns against stuff like that was really confronting and challenging and sort of heart-sickening at times, but also just a really steadfast reminder that my personal belief was that God had put us together in a marriage, and that the Song of Songs has this really strong call to fidelity. And so I was inclined to trust God and persevere in that. And I have a verse from the Song of Songs tattooed on me to remind me of that. And I'm pleased to report that it has worked out very well.